All right, so let's take a look now at the domain name service. We saw in the last video that hosts on the internet are identified by a 32-bit number, the IP address, which is usually written as a sequence of four 8-bit numbers separated with dots. But that's a not very human-friendly way to refer to computers. So the domain name system, or DNS, was introduced to give us a way to map between human readable host names, something like twitter.com, for example, or uky.edu, into particular IP addresses. The DNS, domain name system, is organized as a tree. There is the root. There are a total of 13 logical servers called the root servers, which are operated by companies and organizations across the world, and know how to find the servers for particular top-level domains. Then each of those top-level domains, .net, .edu, .gov, .com, and these days many, many more, like .horse and .golf, but also the country code top-level domains, like .uk for Great Britain or .us for the United States. Each of those top-level domains will have its own server or set of servers, which can look up things within those domains. Within each of those, for example, edu, there are second level domains, so mit.edu, uky.edu, berkeley.edu. The server or servers for .edu know how to look up MIT, UKY, Berkeley, and forward requests onto servers with forward requests onto DNS servers for those domains. So UKY itself has a DNS server, which is able to look up addresses for many things within UKY. So myuk.uky.edu, for example. Then there are also other domain servers within UK. For example, the CS department has its own, which manages cs.uky.edu. And within that, there are different host names and different IP addresses for them. So www.cs.uky.edu, mail.cs.uky.edu, and for that matter, your virtual machine, your linkblue.cs.uky.edu. So when you send a request to translate something like www.cs.uky.edu into an IP address, here's what happens. Your computer talks to a domain name server, which is probably operated by your internet service provider. This server doesn't have the information for every host out there on the internet or every domain name out there on the internet. That would be way too much. But what it does know is how to contact the root servers. So your ISP server, when you ask for the address of www.cs.uky.edu, you'll send that request to your ISP. Your ISP will send that to the root server, or to a root server, one of those 13, and the root server will reply to your ISP and say, .edu is handled by this other server. So then your ISP's domain server, your ISP's DNS server, will contact the edu server and ask, what is the address for www.cs.uky? And that server itself still doesn't have all of the domain names. There are way too many of those, and we want to be able to manage those at a local level so that folks in the CS department don't have to contact some global registry every time they add a new computer to the network. So the edu server will itself reply back to your ISP's name server saying, well, UKY is handled by this particular server and the IP address for that server. So then your ISP's name server will contact the UKY name server and ask, what's the address for www.cs? UKY's name server itself doesn't have that information. That's managed by the CS department, not campus-wide ITS. So it will send a message back to your ISP's name server saying, well, cs.uky.edu is handled by this server, and an IP address of the name server managed by the CS department. Then your ISP's name server will contact that server and say, what's the address for www? And that server now does know what that address is. It has the table for everything within cs.uky.edu. So it will reply back to your ISP saying, well, that's 128.163.146.21. Then now that your ISP's name server has the full information that you requested, it will send a response back to you saying, okay, www.cs.uky.edu has this IP address. And now your computer can, or programs running on your computer, can use that IP address to put together packets to send to the CS department web server. Now, as you can imagine, that whole process can be kind of slow. Not slow as in seconds, but hundreds of milliseconds at the very least. So also your ISP's name server will do caching. It will, when it sees that you made a request for www.cs.uky.edu and it got the IP address back, it will remember that, at least for a period of time. And until that entry expires, and the maintainer of the CS department web server can say how long it should be cached, how long until that information expires. But until it does, anytime someone else on your ISP looks up www.cs.uky.edu, your ISP server will just reply back with the number that it already has, the number that it's saved in its cache. Of course, those caches have limited size. We don't want to fill up the entire DNS with every possible entry. And also, they do timeout. And that timeout is not just to, or that expiration is not just to free up space, but it's also because the CS department might decide to change things around and move a particular server to a different IP address. They can update their tables for that, but if your ISP's DNS has cached the entry, has cached that www.cs.uky.edu is this particular address, and it gets moved to a different address, until that entry expires, your ISP will be reporting back incorrect information. But after some amount of time, and again, that depends on how the maintainers of the particular domain in question set up their tables. But after some amount of time, it will forget that, have to send the request out to the root servers, and eventually get a response back from the CS department name server, which will have the new IP address. Which means if you move things around from one address to another while keeping the domain name, there will be a period of time where not everyone on the network or on the internet is able to access the machine because their ISP or their name server might still be caching the old result. But eventually they will start getting the new results and things will work. So you might hear about, well, we made a network reconfiguration. It will take some time for that information to propagate out to the internet. That's what they mean. It will take some time for various ISPs and other name servers that were caching that information to forget the old obsolete information from their cache and obtain the new information by doing that recursive query to the root, and then the edu, and then the UKY, and then the CS name server. So I mentioned that mapping between IP addresses and domain names is in a database called DNS, the Domain Name System. It's a collection of entries for hosts defining that host as having a particular address. And as we saw, it's arranged in a hierarchical form to match the way that domain names are laid out. There's a program that will let you look up DNS entries. That's called NS Lookup. It's available on just about every Unix system. Also, there's a version of it for Windows. And there are other programs that let you do things that let you do a little more complicated queries as well. There's another program called Hostname, which tells you the hostname of your machine. So let's switch over to the virtual machine. So here's my virtual machine. I can do NS lookup, www.cs.uky.edu, and it will give me back a particular address along with some additional information. So first of all, the server, this is the DNS that my virtual machine is communicating with, 127.0.0.53. Well, 127 is a special domain name, 127.0.0.anything, or not domain name, but IP prefix, is what's called the loopback interface. It refers to something running on this computer. So actually, my virtual machine is running its own name server. That way, it could do the caching locally. It can make those requests to the root servers and so on without all of the virtual machines having to communicate with a single point of failure. And you'll also notice the response I got back was a non-authoritative answer. That's because I'm getting something back from the cache. I've already, sometime in the past, looked up www.cs.uky.edu on this virtual machine. It got the response back and it saved it in its cache. So in the cache, I see that www.cs.uky.edu has a canonical name of bud.cs.uky.edu. That is to say, this domain name is actually an alias for this one. And if you ask what's the IP address for this one, for bud, you will see that for that name, the address is this, 128.163.146.21. I can look up other things as well. For example, Twitter. And you'll notice here I got back 2 IP addresses for the results. So there are 2 different IP addresses that both serve the www.twitter.com, which is really just an alias for twitter.com domain name. Meaning when I make a request to twitter.com, it will more or less at random pick one of these and communicate with that IP address. So on Twitter's network, they have to be able to make sure that those 2 IP addresses are in sync. Really, on the Twitter side, each of these IP addresses is probably served by several servers, and they have network hardware and software that will take a request and route it along to the appropriate server for whatever it is you're doing on Twitter. All right, and let's take a look at that hostname command. So I can do hostname, and that will tell me the domain name for my particular machine. In this case, it's nmore0, which is short for nmore0.cs.uky.edu. And there are various configuration files. For example, /etc/resolve.conf, which have information about that. What name server I'm using on my machine. And if I type nmore0, what does that refer to? In this case, host nmore0.openstacklocal. And, well, there isn't anything there. All right, so we saw that we can have a single host name refer to multiple IP addresses. It's also possible to have different host names all refer to the same IP address. For example, NS lookup www.cs.uky.edu, and the same thing with bud.cs.uky.edu, as we saw. Those are aliases for each other, so they refer to the same address. All right. So it is finally, not necessarily all that common, but it's possible to have a domain name that doesn't map to any particular IP address. Why would you do that? Well, in the DNS database, there is other information associated with domains besides simply an IP address. For example, there may be an entry saying mail for this domain, email for this domain. So something at ics.cs.cmu.edu, for example, goes to a particular server. So even though ics.cs.cmu.edu, for example, doesn't have an IP address, you can still send email to that, for example, because of the entries in the DNS. And we can look up more information about a domain with another program. Instead of NS lookup, we can use dig. And this will give me back the information in a little bit different format. This is actually what the tables for DNS look like. So www.cs.uky.edu. This dot is to indicate that that's the top level. 6730, this is the amount of time in seconds before the entry times out. It is an internet domain name. It's possible to have things other than IN here, although not necessarily all that common. It has the canonical name, so it is an alias for this. And then bud.cs.uky.edu is an entry about the internet. It has an address. A stands for address, or for a IPv4 address of 128.163.146.21. If I were to look up just cs.uky.edu, I can see it has an address. But let me add another command line option, any. This says I want all of the records, not just the addresses and canonical names, but all of the records for cs.uky.edu. And this gives me some more information. The source of authority for cs.uky.edu, that is the canonical name server, the email address. This is just a funny way of writing hostmaster at cs.engr.uky.edu, and then some information about different kinds of timeouts. The name servers for cs.uky.edu are these. So if I want to find something within cs.uky.edu, I or my ISP's name server or the name server running on my virtual machine have to eventually communicate with one of these two machines. And typically there are two as a kind of redundancy, so that if one of these computers were to go down, people would still be able to look up www.cs.uky.edu and get a response. This MX record is the mail exchanger, satchmo.cs.engr.uky.edu. This is the computer that handles email for anything within the cs.uky.edu domain. So if you send an email to my address, neil@cs.uky.edu, it will eventually get routed to this server, which will handle the email and deliver it into my mailbox. There can be text records. These records are for something called DMARC and SPF, Sender Policy Framework, which are ways of specifying some security information. In particular, who is allowed to send email from uky.edu. Apologies, my connection seems to have frozen up. And there can be a few other things as well. There we go. All right, so I think that's all I wanted to talk about for DNS. So next time I'll talk a little bit more about making connections on the internet.